Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be looking at a global compact on migration and migrants, which is a very important topic that does not get very much coverage. My guest today is someone who's very knowledgeable about this particular issue. Today we're going to be talking with Mr. Shabari Nair, and Mr. Shabari Nair is an Indian national who is a technical specialist on migration and other multilateral issues with the United Nations International Labor Organization, commonly called ILO. He's also ILO's focal person for the Global Compact on Migration. Shabari, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you being with me today. We've covered a lot of the ILO topics because they're so important, and there's so many of them too, but I don't think we've really ever gotten into migration, and that's one that we really need to learn more about. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about the International Labor Organization. When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Thank you, Bill. The International Labour Organization was formed in 1919. It is the House of Social Justice in that sense. It's an organization that is driven by two priority issues. One is the issue of the decent work agenda, and the other one is of international labor standards and the normative framework that revolves around the lives of workers and those at work and the people at work. In fact, in 1919, when the ILO Constitution was established, it very clearly says that that social justice can be achieved only if there is universal and lasting peace. And this universal and lasting peace for social justice can also be a mode for the protection of the rights of all workers, including those who are employed in countries not from their own. So in that sense, it's a very important message, mission, and vision for an organization such as the ILO. In 1919, and perhaps just to put that message forward as well. In 1919, when the organization was established, the ILO Constitution preamble also states the economic interdependence, or recognizes the economic interdependence of countries in the world. And this is way back. I mean, this is 100 years back. And I think that's very special, you know. So it actually says that if countries are not able to adopt humane labor standards for their workers, it would affect how other countries want to do the same. You know, so that's actually a part of the preamble of the ILO Constitution. And this is a mission and vision that I think ILO has followed in a tripartite structure very strongly, you know, with the role of the governments, the employers, the workers, and all of them coming together.
And of course, that was a very momentous time, right after World War I, 1918, it ended. 1919, the beginning of the League of Nations, which was the precursor of the United Nations.
That's right.
So it was a really propitious time, I think, for major organizations and major events to take place. And of course, we see where we are today. You mentioned the tripartite arrangement. That's a very unique entity, and I think the ILO is probably the only one that really has it in its charter. What exactly is that?
I think the best way to define this, in fact, for me, as someone that joined the ILO very recently, when I walk into the ILO building, the ILO headquarters in Geneva, I'm struck by not just the size of the building, but also about how the building is divided. So I'm going to answer your question in a roundabout manner.
Okay.
On one side of the building, you've got the North Wing, which has a set of administrative offices. On the south side, which is the South Wing, you've got the office, the meeting rooms. And then in between, you've got the central building itself. These three structures together comprise the ILO headquarters. And the reason why they were designed in this, why the building was designed in such a manner, was to signify the importance of the tripartite structure. The employers, the trade unions, or the workers, and the governments coming together. Isn't there's this old saying, isn't there, Bill, when we talk about how far we can go when we work together, or we go fast when we work alone. Yeah? I think ILO and its tripartite structure is exactly that. It's about going far. It's about working together so as to have sustainable peace, so as to have social and economic progress, so that you don't take steps back from that. And that's how the tripartite structure, in that sense, is so unique to the ILO and what it brings to the UN's family as a whole.
Exactly. Of course, you're bringing the three stakeholders together, government, businesses, and labor.
Yeah.
all of them have a stake in
Yes.
what's going on.
Yes.
And they all should be involved in the decision-making process. And that's very important. Now, our viewers can go to your website, www.ilo.org, to get more information
That's right.
about the International Labor Organization. Very briefly, we'll be talking about this as we go along through the program. What are, category-wise, what are your 4 pillars of the International Labor Organization?
The ILO's main, let's look at it from the perspective of the decent work agenda. And this is where the 4 pillars emanate from. The decent work agenda is an umbrella agenda. It looks at jobs creation, number 1. Number 2, rights at work. Number 3, social protection. And number 4, social dialogue. Now, they're all intertwined in that there is no rights at work if there is no social dialogue. And ILO, in that sense, exactly going back to the previous point, is the perfect example of governments, employers, and workers coming together, which is a social dialogue in that sense. These 4 pillars have to work in a manner that is conjoint in nature. Only then will we be able to achieve what is now in that form the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. Else, we would not have had a goal 8 within the SDGs, which looks at employment and decent work for all. So these 4 pillars together would help in reducing hunger, reducing inequality, or eradicating hunger, reducing inequalities and eradicating poverty in a world that is much more equitable and just, in a world that is much more safe, clean, in a world that is much more prosperous for its people. And so these would basically help in a world that comes together in that sense.
And you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015 by the UN General Assembly. All 193 countries at the UN adopted them, and these are very logical, practical, measurable goals to do, well, 17 of them, and you mentioned to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women and children, to combat climate change, to promote sustainability, and these are also very vital, and to promote good work, clean work, decent work, and that is exactly what the world should be focusing on. And the SDGs have really been, I think, a rallying cry for a large number of the non-governmental organizations. Almost all the governments are supporting. In fact, every government I know of is supporting them. So it's really important to focus on these, and they tie right into what you're doing.
Absolutely. In fact, I remember coming out of the Millennium Development Goals and having focused on the SDGs in my previous avatar. The Millennium Development, the Millennium Development Goals was 8 goals, 18 targets, and 48 indicators. Cut to or fast forward to 2015, and we've got 17 goals, 169 targets, and close to 232 global indicators, which then have to be translated to the national and regional levels. Fascinating world we live in. Within 15 years, governments all over the world, all the 193 UN member states understood the complexity of the world that we live in, and taking into consideration also that we cannot just stick to what was initially agreed on. And that also shows the evolution and the evolving government perspectives on the world as a whole, which I think was tremendous. Initially, we never saw migration within the MDGs. But now, fast forward to 2015, on the SDGs, you see migration peppered all across this agenda. What was initially considered toxic is now important and recognized as a factor for development itself.
It's a different world today. It certainly is. Well, that's a great segue. What is the Global Compact on Migration, which is where you're focusing most of your energy and activities?
In 2015, the year was critical, and critical in the sense that perhaps never before since the Second World War have we seen such a mass movement of people. The Mediterranean crisis perhaps was one big one. The other one was the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal crisis in Asia. And we saw huge mass movements of people. And there was a rallying cry from governments that this needs to be addressed in the context of a UN discussion. This helped the establishment of, or rather led to a summit, a high-level summit, on the 19th of September 2016, literally titled Addressing Large Movements of Migrants and Refugees. This particular summit adopted a declaration. the New York Declaration for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. It had two annexes. One was the Global Compact on Migration, and the other one was a Global Compact on Refugees. The idea is then to see how best these two global compacts, which have been consulted and negotiated, and negotiations continue till the middle of the year, once they are adopted, how best can they be implemented in a manner that actually provides more protection for migrants and refugees around the world. So this is, in a nutshell, what the Global Compact on Migration, or where it comes from, along with its twin, which is the Global Compact on Refugees.
This, so often we hear, or maybe I hear these various folks referring to refugees at times and migrants another. There is a distinction, is there? Obviously there is. You just mentioned a minute ago. How do you define a refugee as opposed to someone who's a migrant?
In fact, there is no clear definition for migrant. There are many organizations that work on migration issues, ILO being one of them. We all define migrant, the word migrant, in different ways. But I'll come to that in a second. But refugees, now, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was established as a result of a 1951 Refugee Convention. Very clearly defined mandate and a very clear definition for refugees. It's basically anybody who is running away from civil war, strife, conflict, and persecution. And they can't return to their country of origin. That clearly gives them a definition for refugees. This is where I think the lines get blurry, because the Mediterranean crisis and the Andaman Sea crisis and other mass movements saw a mixed migration. Saw movements of both refugees and others who are not in that category for international protection as classified by the High Commissioner for Refugees as a result of the mandate given to them by the Refugee Convention. So in that sense, I think this is where the lines blur. We can also see that in the negotiations and how they are shaping up when governments say, how do we exactly define the complementarities between the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees?
I see. Now, ILOs, you're going to be very involved in these discussions that will be running on for the next several months in New York at the United Nations. What role will ILO play? What are there particular aspects that you're going to be looking at, or will you be looking at the 4 pillars of the ILO and the Decent Work Agenda and the SDGs and bringing that all together? What role do you see for yourself as this scenario unfolds?
It's interesting you ask that question, because if you look at the broader figures around migrants and migration, there are, as of last year, 2017, on the 18th of December, which is International Migrants Day, UNDESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, released a report, a report on migration statistics, which, as of now, the most recent figures say 258 million people are migrants. Out of those 258 million, close to 22 million are refugees. But if you take off these numbers of refugees and displaced people and so on, you get about 150 million people who are migrant workers. So 150 million out of a 258 million population is about 65%. In that sense, where does ILO fit in? If 150 million or 65% of workers are migrant workers, of migrants are migrant workers, then where does ILO fit in? I think it's only but obvious that ILO has an important role to play. Now, the Global Compact on Migration itself has 22 objectives with corresponding actionable commitments. There are objectives that range from issues pertaining to data on migrant workers, which is still far and few in between in terms of availability. There are objectives on recruitment of migrant workers, skills development, social protection, and these are elements that I mentioned are part of the decent work agenda. In that sense, ILO is the one agency that is critical in talking about migration to before they leave the country of origin and when they reach the country of destination. Whether it is in terms of jobs, whether it is in terms of the skills that they acquire when they come back to their country, whether it is in terms of recruitment, of how they are recruited in the first place through certain fair guidelines of recruitment and so on. So it's a whole range of issues that ILO has in terms of the Global Compact itself.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you're involved with an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like the shows and you want to share them with family, friends, neighbors, whatever the case might be, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very interesting global compact on migration and what the role of the International Labor Organization is in the development of this compact. My guest today is an expert on this particular topic. My guest today is Mr. Shabari Nair, and Mr. Shabari Nair is a technical specialist on migration and other multilateral issues with the United Nations International Labor Organization. Shabari, we're talking about the role of the ILO in this particular situation. How far along at this point? Now, this global compact will not be concluded for several months. Where are we at this point? Are we at the preliminary stages? And if we are, who are some of the other players coming together to talk about this very important compact?
Some of the most important players, of course, the most important players are the governments themselves. There are all the governments have come on board to negotiate the Global Compact on Migration. So that's the number one priority. It's a non-legally binding document. I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind going forward. We've finished 3 rounds of negotiations. We've got 3 more rounds to go. The funny thing is, to an extent, a lot of these discussions did not start just as a result of the negotiations themselves. There was a year-long consultation period, which is important for us to keep in mind. So before the governments even came to the table to negotiate this document, a lot of the issues were clarified in that sense. Of course, there was a need for clarification of certain other issues. That certainly happened over the last few months, over the last few rounds. And now going forward, I think we will see a much more active government participation. There are some important elements that need to be solved, particularly with regards to how this compact will be implemented itself. And that will be once it is adopted in Morocco at the end of the year in December. So going forward in 2019, implementation will be a priority issue.
And when this is completed, what would you like to see as some of the end results, some of the final major recommendations and the requirements? Again, as you mentioned, it's voluntary. And of course, the governments, after they adopt it, it's sort of guidelines for what they should be able to do in helping the migration issue and migrants. But what would be the ideal agreement at the end of the process?
Any agreement that is that has been negotiated and that has been reached by consensus is already an ideal agreement. I think that's certainly the first way to look at this. In that sense, the Global Compact is perhaps the most positive force in the context of migration and in a global level, with a global agenda that we have seen now coming out of the United Nations. Going forward, there are many aspects to be considered. One, we need to recognize, and this governments are already doing, is to recognize the importance of decent work. That majority migrants are labor migrants. If we keep that in mind, if we talk about how this is a global compact on safe, orderly and regular migration, then that safe, orderly and regular migration mostly connotes to labor migrants and labor migration, people who travel in a safe, orderly and regular manner. If it is about labor migration, then we need to give importance to the issue of decent work. Certainly something that governments are pushing for. We see a lot of activity around it. In fact, I will be in discussions over the course of the next 2 weeks prior to the Global Compact's 4th round exactly on this issue.
And that is such a critical issue. It certainly is. Do you hear a lot of, we hear so much what I consider misinformation, sound and fury, noise, whatever the case might be, about refugees, about what refugees do when they come to certain countries, and especially in the United States. We have a lot of misinformation, especially because of some of the media outlets in this country. But is there a lot of misinformation or floating around about migrants at this point? Do you hear those, or is that just basically geared towards refugees, and maybe people don't know what's happening with migrants? I'm not too sure what, but do you have a lot of mythology out there?
There is a lot of misinformation. The media has a huge role to play here. The media is certainly, it's not easy, simply because there is an audience to cater to when it comes to media and the information that is out there. We're also living in a technologically highly sensitive period where information is at our fingertips in that sense. But is it the right information, I think, is one that we need to be more self-aware of and perhaps even self-censor in that sense. Here's perhaps one issue that keeps coming up is everybody from Africa is coming to Europe. It's not the case. In fact, far from it. In fact, 80% of, close to 80% of migrants from Africa are actually moving within Africa. Yeah. And the few others are, yes, going to Europe, but on a regular basis. Quite a few are going to the Middle East. Most migration is intra-regional. And that's the first thing we need to keep in mind. In fact, most migration within Europe or in Europe is actually within Europe. So that's something we need to be sensitive about. We also need to understand and keep in mind the role that migration plays in the development of countries of origin. It's not just countries of destination themselves. In some countries in Asia, close to 30% of the GDP comes from remittances. Yeah. That's huge. I mean, if we take off that particular remittance part of it, then that economy collapses in a huge way. So these are, I think, important aspects and facets to put forward. Take, for instance, in the question of families left behind. You know, we all think that migrants are here to steal our jobs, but they actually have a family to cater to, and they are there in countries of destination because there is a demand for them in the first place. There is a labor demand for them. We're living in countries which have aging demographies, like in Europe and in the Americas and in North America. Certainly then migrants contribute to filling those labor demands and gaps within these countries. I think this set of information should be out there for everyone to know about, to take informed decisions on how they react to migrants themselves.
So how did you, before you were a regional advisor to the Swiss government on Asia, as I recall, that was your previous avatar, as you would say. How did you get involved in this? What was the attraction to move from that position, or did that help pave the way to move into this one?
Right. Well, then we have to start perhaps 38 years back.
We only have a minute and a half.
I was born in a small state in the south of India called Kerala. I was brought up in the Middle East because my parents were migrant workers. My father was a migrant worker. So migration is a part and parcel of who I am and what I was always interested in, particularly in the context of labor rights and migrant rights. Because I've seen my father struggle. I've seen how difficult it was for him to succeed and come up in his own life in that sense. So when I got posted by the Swiss administration to Asia, it was a perfect combination of my own personal background coming to fore in Asia and the work that the government of Switzerland did in Asia. We worked very closely, or the Swiss government worked very closely with ILO. This was a good opportunity for me to also make those links with the ILO, and again, after having spent time in the field, now to come back to the Global Compact negotiations in the UN headquarters in New York. It's perfect in the sense that I'm able to bring those evidence, that important evidence from the ground, where we can say, guys, this is not exactly how it works on the ground. So it's really helpful. Yeah,
it was in your family. You have
in my family
on hands, on the ground, and on hands experience.
In that sense, Bill, aren't we all migrants?
Yeah. That's very true. Yeah. We are, and probably were at some point in time, or maybe in the future. And of course, this is an extremely important topic, and it's one, as you mentioned, the media are so critical, and hopefully they'll be putting the spotlight on this convention on migration and talking about it, and to help inform the public, not just in the United States, but around the world. world, and I know you're certainly doing a lot with the United Nations International Labor Organization. As I mentioned earlier, our viewers can go to www.ilo.org to get more information on this topic and many others, because the ILO has a very broad agenda, and you deal with a whole spectrum of issues. We've talked on this program about human trafficking, we talked about decent work, we've talked about artificial intelligence, we've talked about Social Security, safety nets, just on across the board. But it's so important that we learn about these. But Shabari Nair, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.